The village of Kayukse was both blessed and cursed by its location. Nestled in the sun drenched plains of central Burma, its vast emerald fields yielded some of the most finest and abundant rice crops in the entire region. In times of peace, it was a sanctuary of wealth. But peace was a distant memory. For nearly 3 decades, the land had been torn apart by the Ava Pegu War, a brutal and grinding civil conflict for the imperial throne. To the north, the fierce Burmese kingdom of Ava demanded total fealty. To the south, the affluent Mon kingdom of Pegu launched bloody campaigns to expand its borders. Kayukse sat right on the razor's edge between them. And because rice was the literal lifeblood of marching armies, the village became an open target. Rogue mercenary factions and desperate loyal guards from the rival kingdoms routinely raided the borders, torching granaries and slaughtering anyone who stood in their way. In this fractured world, grain was as valuable as gold, and a farmer's field was as dangerous as a frontline trench. The chief of the village, Tuji, knew this well. He worried constantly about the crops, not only from rodents and thieves, but also from the possibility of attacks by soldiers from rival kingdoms. So he assigned a group of men to night security to guard the fields after dark. They watched from rooftops and from the outer edges of the village. Sometimes, when exhaustion set in, they would sit or lie beneath trees. Some carried old matchlock muskets, others only had spears and knives, listening for the movement of animals entering the fields. Their main duty was simple: protect the crops at night. Among them was a man named Lyong, who served as the head of the security unit that evening. Lyong liked his job, although it did not pay him as much as he would have preferred. He watched the richer merchants in their large houses and longed to own one himself someday. He thought perhaps this position might bring him a little closer to that dream. Unfortunately, it paid far less than he had expected, and he was bitter about that. But he kept the job. One night, while he was on watch, he heard sounds in the distance. He called out to a man stationed on the roof of a nearby building and asked him to confirm what he could see. The man looked out into the darkness and said, "I don't know, sir. It looks like a light coming from inside the field. I'm not sure, but it could be a fire." At the mention of the word fire, Lyong panicked. He rushed out with a group of his men toward the field. When they reached the clearing, they found a bonfire burning in the middle of the crops, where farmers usually gathered harvest stalks into bundles. And around that bonfire was a group of people laughing and playing a game. It looked as though they were passing something around inside the circle. At first, Lyong thought it was some kind of garland. But this was not an ordinary garland. It shone strangely in the firelight. The thick tongues of flame seemed to glisten against it as it moved from person to person. And as they passed it around, they sang an eerie song. Lyong looked at the men around the fire. They seemed to be the king's guards. "Where did you get the gold chain from?" he asked. A man in the circle looked up and said, "Why, it's from the king himself." The others chimed in, "Yes, we did him a great deal of service as we fought his war and won. And he still sits the throne, so he gave this to us. Now we're fighting amongst ourselves to see who deserves it most." "Well, we're not fighting," another guard said with a grin. "We're having a competition. Whoever it falls on has to wear it and reveal his biggest conquest." Lyong studied them for a moment and then suddenly saw an opportunity. Oh, he said, then I want to be a part of the game. One of the men looked at him and laughed. And why do you think you deserve it? Lyong's own men shifted uneasily behind him. Sir, are you sure you know what you're doing? One of them whispered. Lyong raised his hand and continued. I have protected this land, and as you know, we bring a great deal of profit from the crops here. We also feed the rest of the region. He adjusted the belt around his waist and lifted his chin as though he were commanding authority. I think I have a story worthy of winning. The king's guardsmen laughed at that. Sir, whispered one of Lyong's men again, I strongly advise against this. I know what I'm doing, Lyong said. So Lyong sat in the circle with the others and the game began. The garland passed from hand to hand while the group recited the song. Almost conveniently, it stopped on Lyong. He took the garland, placed it around his neck. Then he looked down at it, his eyes fixed on the thick gold chain, as though he could already imagine what it would mean to own such a thing. He stood up. He was going to make up one of the craziest stories they had ever heard. But then, something unbelievable happened. The fire suddenly died. All the king's guards suddenly turned at once into hooded figures in black robes. They had hollow faces. Right then and there, Lyong's men watched as he choked and fell to the ground. They ran through the fields and back to the village. When they reached Tuji, they explained what they had seen. The village bells were raised in alarm, and soon everyone came rushing out to discover what had happened. Tuji, the guards, and several villagers returned to the same spot. There, they found Lyong's lifeless body on the ground. There was no gold chain, only a rope, a simple rope wrapped around his neck. He had been strangled. The village elders did not need to track the footprints that were in there. They knew what Lyong had stumbled upon. They called them the Knot of the Fallen Guards, the ghost battalions of the Civil War. Years ago, a company of the king's elite royal guards had been sent to defend these very fields. Ambushed by the rival kingdom, they were slaughtered to a man and left to rot in the mud, denied a proper burial. Folklore said that their spirits remained trapped in a perpetual loop, forever playing with the very same executioner's ropes that ended their lives. To the living, their twisted spirits appeared as glistening gold chains, a manifestation of the earthly greed that drove men to fight in the wars of kings. Lyong wanted a piece of the king's wealth, and so the dead gave him exactly what the king had given them: a sudden, violent end. If you enjoy that story, like, comment, and share your thoughts. And if you have a favorite tale from your own country or culture, drop it below or email me at asian.myth.horror@gmail.com. I'm always hunting for new stories to feature. I had a blind uncle. He used to be a carpenter, but he lost his eyesight because of his work. He was actually my mom's uncle, which made him my granduncle, and he lived with us. His wife died young because diabetes wasn't something that was treated properly back then. They had no kids. So my mom decided to let him move in with us. He was also a war veteran, and you'd think someone who fought for his country would be respected and cared for. But PTSD must have stayed with him his whole life. He had no one to care for him, and he was already too old by then. Years earlier, He had lost his home to a gambling problem. He picked up carpentry afterward, trying to rebuild his life. And that's how he eventually lost his eyesight. I guess we all felt sorry for him and for the way things turned out for him. I, however, tried to keep his spirits up. I'd spend time playing chess with him, just talking. He was a kind and gentle soul, and he loved sharing stories from his time at war. He talked about his travels and once described watching a drunk man in a bar stab his commanding officer. He also told some fairly strange, unsettling stories. Some of them didn't make much sense, so we just assumed his mind was slipping and we let it be. He was also a restless sleeper. Some nights he would wake up choking or screaming. It usually happened on no moon nights or dark moon nights. My dad wasn't thrilled about him staying over and told my mom he'd be better off in a care home. They argued about it often. My mom had promised my grandmother that he would be taken care of after she passed, and she felt she was simply carrying out her mother's wishes. Then, one night, everything changed. We all woke up to the sound of him making noises, and it was my turn to go check on him. But when I got there, my heart dropped to my stomach. I saw something black, shaped like an imp, sitting on my uncle's chest, trying to choke him. I immediately screamed. The imp turned, looked at me, and smiled. Then it got up and walked behind the kitchen wall. My parents came rushing over and found me trembling. I tried to tell them what I saw, but I started stammering. I had never stammered before in my life, but somehow I couldn't get the words out. I couldn't sleep afterwards. My fever had spiked, and my mom kept trying everything to bring it down. My uncle, however, was fast asleep, as if nothing had happened. In the morning, I told my mom what I had seen. At least I tried to. I explained that it had bulging eyes, a long tail, two small horns, and a wide, wide mouth. It was barely 2 feet tall. My mom told me I was just having a bad dream. I should have known they would dismiss my story. But that didn't explain the other strange things that had been going on in the house since my uncle moved in. Things would suddenly go missing. Candles in the prayer room would go out immediately after being lit. Once my mom wore a pearl necklace for her birthday, and something unseen pulled at it and snapped the string right in front of us. That was a really chilling moment. My mom just told us the string was old, but we all saw what happened. Eventually, I got older and moved out of the country. I started my own business selling computer parts. This was still in the early 2000s. I made quite a bit of money, but I still have trouble with my speech. I've sought help for it over the years. My uncle died of old age. He never saw the inside of a nursing home. I still wonder, even now, what that thing really was. Whatever it did to me that night, my speech was never quite the same again, even after all these years. In Java, old stories are often tied to the land itself. A place does not simply remain a place. It remembers what was buried under it, what passed through it, and what was once feared there. In the central parts of the island, where the soil still breathes warm after rain, and where the ground can still split with steam or mud, people have long believed that some legends are not just stories. They are warnings given a name. One of those warnings belongs to Jaka Linglong. The tale is usually told as part of the greater story of Aji Saka, the civilizing hero who defeated the cruel king Dewata Senkar and brought order to the land. Jaka Linglong in those stories was said to be Aji Saka's son, born in serpent form, fierce and strange. and later cast out of his hunger, grew dangerous. In some versions, he wandered deep into the earth and later surfaced in places where the ground itself seemed alive. In Grobogan and Bellora, his legend became tied to muddy vents, earth tremors, and the strange breath of the land. In a village in one of the steaming fields lived a man named Sutarjo. He was a bamboo splitter by trade, the kind of man who rose before sunrise and came home each evening with his hands aching and his clothes covered in dust. He lived with his wife, his elderly mother, and two sons in a house on the edge of a low plain, not far from the hot ground people avoided after dark. His life was plain, almost stubbornly ordinary. He fixed fences, sold bamboo poles to market traders, and spent most evenings sitting quietly with his family while the sound of insects filled the dark. He had no interest in old tales. His wife did, though. She had grown up learning the elders speak of places where the earth had a mouth, though she usually laughed when she mentioned it. The laughter, however, did cease when strange things started happening behind their house. The first sign was the sound, nothing human nor animal like. It rose from beneath the ground one evening after it had rained. A slow, wet grinding, as if something enormous was shifting its body far below the soil. The chickens went silent. The dog refused to go near the back fence. Sutajo went out with a lantern and found that the ground near the field trembled faintly, a patch of mud rising and falling as though it were breathing. He convinced himself that it was gas escaping the soil. He told his wife the same thing. The land did not stop moving. A few nights later, his younger son came running inside, crying, insisting something had spoken to him from the field. At first, Sutajo assumed the boy had been dreaming, but the child swore he had heard a man's voice calling him from the darkness, a deep voice, slow and uncertain, as if each word had to force its way up through the layers of earth before it could be spoken. The next morning, there were marks in the mud outside the fence, long and dragging, curved in a way no footprint should be. But they couldn't be sure. Sleep grew thin in the house after that. Sutajo's mother said the rooms felt crowded even when no one was in them. His wife found wet patches spreading across the floorboards near the rear wall, though the roof did not leak. The air around the field changed too. Some mornings, sour with mud and stagnant water, other times carrying a faint rot, as if something buried too shallow had begun trying to come up. Then the goats started to disappear. One was found 3 days later near the steaming field, torn apart and half buried in mud. The villagers blamed wild dogs. Sutajo looked at the wounds and said nothing. They were cut clean. The attack seemed deliberate, the grooves in the earth leading away from the carcass as if something had dragged it, turned, and moved back underground. That was when the old men in the village told him to stay away from the field. They said that the place had history, that the vents were not simply vents, but signs of a path below. They spoke of an old story, a great serpent cast out long ago and left to wander beneath the earth, bound forever to places where the soil shook and the mud split open. The name Jakalinglung wasn't mentioned. They said it the way people mention a name they don't wish to wake. Sutajo did not believe them. His elder son was missing. The boy had gone to gather bamboo from the back of the yard and never reached the storage shed. Sutajo found the basket lying in the grass, the stalks scattered, and beside it a narrow crack splitting the mud, moist, dark, as if the earth had briefly lifted itself from below and closed again. There were no cries, no signs of struggle, only that small open seam in the ground. The village went searching for the boy. They found him sitting at the edge of the steaming field, muddy, shaking, unable to speak. When he finally did, he mentioned that he followed a voice through the ground. He said it sounded lonely. He said it kept asking whether anyone had come to let it out. Sutajo could no longer pretend the field was ordinary. He dug along the fence himself, hoping he'd find a collapsed burrow, a buried pipe, or anything that might explain the sounds, the smell, the missing animals. Instead, he found an opening beneath the mound of hardened earth, hidden under reeds and stones. The hole was far too small for a man to enter, but kneeling beside it, he felt warm air rising from below, thick and damp, carrying a smell so old it seemed to belong to the earth from before people had ever lived on it. And from that hole came a sound like breathing, like more than one set of lungs. He backed away and went home. That night, he found it difficult to sleep. In the morning, the village elder came to see the opening. He asked whether anyone in the house had been sick, whether anyone had made a promise lately, whether anyone had disturbed the ground near the vent. Sutajo shook his head. The elder stood in silence for a long time before he finally started to narrate the story. Long ago, he said, Jaka Linglung had been cast down after his hunger, and his nature brought harm to the living. In some stories, he had not died but sunk instead, moving beneath fields, swamps, and old roads, searching without rest. Where he passed, the earth opened in strange ways. Where he lingered, things were swallowed. The serpent was not simply hunting. He was searching for something, a place he had once been promised, or perhaps a debt he believed he was still owed. Some of the oldest families in the region were said to have descended from villagers who once made a vow to the old kings, a vow so old that even its exact words had been lost, generation after generation, until the surviving families grew past the lore and went on with their lives, the debt still remaining. Whether the serpent still remembered that vow, or the village had simply forgotten it, the elders weren't sure, only that it had found their field, and that it might not have entirely been by mistake. His son refused to go outside after dark. The goats stopped giving milk. The chickens vanished one by one. At night, the ground near the field trembled in slow waves, and the family could hear something enormous turning beneath the soil. And that's when the house began to crack. Thin lines split the packed earth floor. Water jars tipped over on their own. Clay cracked in the kitchen without being touched. Deep in the night, Sutajo's mother woke up screaming. She felt something moving beneath her own mattress. The family fled into the yard, and under the lantern light, they watched the rear wall of the house bulge outward for a moment, as though something below had pressed briefly against it and then withdrawn. An elder returned with several villagers and marked the ground near the field with lime and prayer ash. Incense was lit, offerings were left. Old words were spoken into the dark. For a while, the field went silent. Then, the ground suddenly opened. Only a narrow slit, wet and black, split the earth. From inside came a sound like a body dragging itself through standing water. And then slowly, something rose, only far enough to break the surface, enough for the villagers to see the curve of a massive back slick with mud, and something like a head turning in the dark. It did not climb out. It didn't need to. The sight of it was enough. The family ran, and so did everyone else. No one returned until sunrise. By then, the slit in the earth had closed. The field looked almost untouched, except for the missing bamboo, the torn goat carcass, and the dark pressed mud, patterned in a way no one wanted to look at closely. After that, Sutajo's family never spent another night in that house. They moved further inland, to a village where the ground stayed cool and quiet. In time, the boy recovered, but never walked again near the open ground after rainfall. He would stop at the edge of any field and stare at it for a long moment, as though listening for something no one else could hear. His mother said he had come back changed. The villagers who stayed behind told the story differently, depending on who asked. Some said the serpent had simply passed through. Others insisted Jaka Linglang had been searching for a way back to the surface for centuries, and that the field had only ever been a temporary opening. A few still claimed that on wet nights, when the ground steamed and the mud seemed to breathe, you could still hear it. The legend of Jaka Linglang warns us that punishment does not always come from above. Sometimes it rises from below, slowly, patiently, through the very land that feeds us. In the old calendar, the seventh month was known as Ghost Month in rural China. It was said that on the first day, the gates of the underworld creaked open, and for one full lunar cycle, the dead walked among the living. Most of them were gentle spirits, ancestors returning to check on their families, to accept incense and paper money, to taste the smoke of the offerings burnt in their name. But not all of them came in peace. There were others, the forgotten, the angry, and the ravenous. The Chinese call them the egui, hungry ghosts, being condemned to wander with throats as thin as needles and bellies that could never be filled, no matter how much they ate. They were driven by greed, by envy, by needs so intense that they became animalistic. On the 15th night of Ghost Month, the peak of the Hungry Ghost Festival, their hunger was at its worst. In the city of Soju, there lived a merchant named Chen. Chen was rich, but not generous. His granaries overflowed with rice, while beggars lined the streets outside his gates. His wine cellars were deep and cool, yet he never offered a cup to the thirsty. When neighbors prepared for Ghost Month, Chen scoffed. He watched them burn paper money, paper clothes, even paper smartphones and cars. Anything to keep the spirits satisfied and far from their doors. He watched them lay out bowls of rice, fruit, and meat on street corners, whispering, "Eat, good brothers, and pass on. Let the dead feed themselves," Chen would say, locking his granaries tighter. "I worked for my wealth. Let them work for theirs." His wife begged him to make at least a small offering. "Just a bowl of rice," she said, "just enough to show respect." Chen refused. "The dead have no claim on the living," he said. "If they are hungry, let them starve." On the 15th night, the city was alive with ritual. Temples glowed with lanterns. Families gathered to burn joss paper, the flames licking the night sky. Opera troupes performed for the spirits on temporary stages, believing that entertainment could appease the wandering dead. Chen, however, stayed indoors. He sat alone in his grand dining hall, a single candle burning before him. On the table was a feast meant for one: steamed fish, braised pork, mountains of rice, jars of wine. He had ordered the servants to leave him in peace. "I will eat tonight," he said to himself, "while the ghosts go hungry." After the feast, he retired to bed and was satisfied with himself. He was suddenly interrupted by a sound. Somewhere deep in the house came the sound of chewing. The sound was slow and wretched, like many mouths working at once, never swallowing, never satisfied. Chen set down his cup and stood up. "Who's there?" he called. There was no answer. The chewing only grew louder. He followed the sound down into the corridor and into the main hall. The heavy wooden doors, which he had locked himself, now stood open. Inside, the room was no longer as he had left it. The candlelight had turned cold and blue. The long dining table stretched far beyond its normal length, as if it belonged to a palace, not a merchant's house. And seated around were figures, dozens of them. Men, women, children, some in tattered robes, others in the remnants of fine silk, now stained with mud and ash. Their bellies were grotesquely swollen, tight as drums. Their necks were thin as thread, as if they had been starved for years. A swarm of hungry ghosts. They turned their heads towards him in unison. Their eyes were hollow, yet burning with need. "Chen?" one of them whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "You would not feed the living. Now you will feast with the dead." Chen tried to step back, but his feet would not move. It was as if invisible hands held him in place. The ghost beckoned. Plates appeared before him, plates he had never ordered. Stale fish, sour wine, rice swarming with maggots. The stench was unbearable. Yet his mouth began to water against his will. "Eat," they hissed. "You hoarded food in life. Now you will eat for eternity." Chen shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No," he choked, "I won't." But his hand moved on its own. They grabbed a handful of rice and shoved it into his mouth. Then another, and another. He chewed, but the food would not go down. His throat, thin as a needle, burned with every swallow. Still, his hand could not stop. He stuffed himself until his belly distended, until his skin felt ready to split, until his vision blurred. The ghosts watched, their hollow faces almost smiling. "More," they whispered. "You have so much, and we have so little." Chen screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the endless chewing around him. He ate and ate. There was no satisfaction. He was trapped in a banquet that had no end. When his servants finally dared to open the dining hall at dawn, they found Chen slumped over the table. His body was bloated, his face twisted in terror. His mouth was crammed with unchewed rice, as if he collapsed mid-bite. There was no sign of the other guests, only the cold remains of Chen's own feast, now spoiled and reeking. The village ordered the body removed, and the room cleansed with incense and talismans. That night, they made extra offerings on the street corner, bowls of rice, paper money, even a small paper house. "For the good brothers," one old woman murmured, "and for any who are still hungry." People in Suzhou still tell the story during Ghost Month. They say that on the 15th night, if you do not make offerings, then it is possible you might have visitors, because the hungry ghosts are always looking for new guests, and if you show them greed in life, they will invite you to their banquet in death.